Well, good morning. Great to see so many of you already tuning here on this Monday, the first show of Spotlight Hawaii here in 2021. It is January 4th. I'm Ryan Kalei-Suji, joined by Yanji Denise. Happy New Year to all of you watching, and thanks so much again for tuning in. You know, Yanji, for the past few months, we've obviously been focusing on COVID-19 and the impact that the coronavirus has had on our community. But moving forward into this next year, we will continue to focus on that, but other issues that are also impacting the state and making headlines. And today, we're going to be addressing one of those issues.
Yeah, that's right. We really want to diversify the conversation in the new year. And one of the things that's been making a lot of news as of late is the idea of a proposed casino in Kapolei on lands owned by the Department of Hawaiian Homes. So joining us today is the Deputy Chairman of DHHL, that is Tyler Gomes. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Tyler. We're already seeing the comments coming in. Please put your questions for Tyler in the comments. We're going to get to as many as possible. But first of all, Tyler, good morning. Let's talk about what you guys are proposing right now. What's the proposal and how did this all come about?
Yeah, aloha, good morning. Ryan, Yunji, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here this morning. Moreover, thanks for an opportunity to have a conversation about this bill that we've put out. And so essentially, it's a proposal that does two things. The first is it creates a Hawaii Gaming Commission, which would be like a regulatory body responsible for regulating, enforcing, investigating the entire operation surrounding the gaming. And that's to really ensure integrity. And then the second thing that it does is it gives that body, that commission, the opportunity to issue a license. And that license is for a single integrated resort on Hawaiian homelands designated for commercial use.
And we know that there has been some pushback already from those in the community. Some lawmakers are already speaking out against this. How realistic do you think this is, given what we've heard so far by lawmakers? And what does this process look like moving forward?
Sure. I think that the opportunity to have a conversation about a number of the shortfalls that the department faces is probably the bigger conversation here. And if we can get through this discussion about how to solve the puzzle of how do we fund the department, how do we provide this department the resources necessary for it to meet its needs, I think that there is potential for a very productive conversation with legislators, regardless of these early comments. As we go through the process, meaning if we can get this bill to the legislature, which I think we can, really the discussion that will happen there will not only be between the lawmakers, it'll also involve input from the business community, from the public, from beneficiaries. And like I said, again, I really think that the opportunity to frame this in terms of the problems that the department faces, in terms of funding and resources, is critical to really solving the bigger problem is how do we get people onto the land?
Well, let's talk about that. There was a pretty lengthy article in the paper a few weeks back talking about just the wait times and the budget shortfalls that your agency is facing. What is the average wait right now, and what would this revenue stream mean for those folks who are actually waiting for a home?
As far as average wait, that's a really hard number to calculate. We know that there are people who have been waiting for at least 30 years. But I think the bigger number and the more troubling number for the department is the estimation that if we were to continue producing homes and lots at the rate that we currently are, and assuming that no one else joined the wait list after today, which we know is not going to happen, at that rate, it would take us 182 years to address the wait list at the current funding levels. In terms of what our current funding levels look like, our sufficient sums budget was about $140 million in the last year. Contrast that with the $20 million we did receive from the legislature. And that's not to say that we're not grateful for that funding. In fact, that's actually historic highs for the funding that the department does receive. But the real problem is nobody's talking about how do we address the $120 million shortfall between what we believe we need and what the state can afford to give us. And this bill does that. This bill, at the very least, promises an additional reliable, dedicated revenue stream that the department has not previously been able to rely upon. Every year, the department sort of comes out with its handout to the legislature asking for money. And to that end, it would be incredibly helpful to this department to know that there was a dedicated stream of revenue that we could count on funding every single year to help bring that wait time down. In the conservative estimates, a casino, as proposed under this bill, could generate maybe $30 million on the low conservative end in revenue. That's another CIP budget for this department. I mean, at the very least, that almost doubles our capacity year year over year. And we've never been able to even contemplate something like that. We plan in 5-year increments because that's the degree to which we can predict the funding we're going to get. If we knew we were going to get continued funding every year at these amounts, we could project out a lot farther than 5 years. I think that would give our beneficiaries who are waiting and who deserve to be placed on the land, who have been on the wait list for over 30 years, some sort of reassurance that we have a path forward, that we have a plan to move forward. And right now, we just don't have the capacity to do that without this kind of revenue stream.
We have heard from the governor who was on this program who talked about looking for other options, and he brought up Kamakana Ali'i and other commercial spaces that have found success on Hawaiian land. What are your thoughts about moving forward in other venues with or other avenues, such as more commercial spaces and malls? How has that proven to be an effective part of this partnership and this agreement that you sort of have had and established with commercial spaces? And could that be looked into to sort of fill the gap rather than having to rely on a casino?
So Kamakana Ali'i has been very successful, and it's in Kapolei, but not to the scale of $30 million. We'd need several Kamakana Ali'is over to reach that number. In addition to that, one of the large concerns that we've been hearing is that given the lack of availability of lands for developing, the more commercial properties we put in our lands they cut into our opportunity to develop for homesteading. And so if we had to develop 3, 4, 5, 10 Kamakana Ali'is to meet the revenue that a single casino could meet, that's available land off the market just to meet those numbers. And I mean, just balancing that out alone, that is not the best use of our land if we could consolidate that magnitude into one parcel alone.
What is your vision for this casino resort? What kind of gaming are we talking about? Who are the customers? Who are we trying to attract here? Is this for Kama'aina, or are we trying to attract more tourists? Or what are you envisioning for this?
Well, the way that the bill is currently drafted, it allows for card games, dice games, and slots. In actuality, how the casino operates and what's going to be offered is going to be up to the Hawaii Gaming Commission. So without speaking for them and it being a lot earlier in the process, I do think that, we have a robust visitor industry in Hawaii. We may not ever get back to 10 million visitors a year. There are many people who do not want 10 million visitors a year, but I think we have to acknowledge the fact that visitors are not going to stop coming to Hawaii. And I think an opportunity to maximize revenue generated from a limited number of visitors is an excellent use of, this sort of integrated resort.
Many will argue and say that bringing a casino to the islands and bringing any sort of gambling here to Hawaii will spur up the crime rate, will increase poverty, will add more of a negative impact to our community rather than the positives that the income and the money generated through these types of gaming casinos will bring. What is your response to that with many who say that it could have these negative adverse side effects by bringing something like this into our community?
I would encourage those folks to look at the data. There are studies in the early 2010s that look at cities like Louisiana, Massachusetts, and Pittsburgh, who all introduced casinos after previously not having them in their communities. And what the data actually showed is that the introduction of those casinos did not cause a measurable spike in crime, in addiction, in poverty. And in fact, in many of those areas, crime rates decreased. I think another thing we have to acknowledge is that in every state in the country right now, there is a problem gambling rate of between 1% and 2%. In fact, Hawaii has a problem gambling rate of 2.2%. What the data from Harvard Medical School shows is that the introduction of gaming doesn't necessarily cause that number to rise. And in fact, that number stabilizes between 1% and 2% in jurisdictions where casinos were introduced. And so rather than speaking to the emotions of this topic, if we just look at the science of it, there are no links between introducing a single casino and large, measurable, detractive spikes of crime, poverty, or addiction. Many of those locations were able to do so because they dedicated funds to proactively address those problems. And that's why our bill is written in a way in which a portion of the funding is dedicated to public health and safety. Because what the data does show is if you do that preemptively, you reduce the risk of increasing or generating any of those harms.
Let's talk about next steps. So now this idea is out in the community. I'm sure you're getting plenty of feedback, both positive and negative, as we see in the comments here this morning. What about lawmakers' support? Obviously, this has to go through the ledge to happen, but what's the sort of time frame for this? Let's talk about immediate next steps and how soon, if this actually did get approved in the next session, how soon we could actually see construction and the opening of a facility like this.
Assuming, and I mean, we've been through a number of legislative sessions. Assuming everything didn't change as it was written, which is probably not going to happen, the bill would give the governor, I think, up to a year to appoint the Hawaii Gaming Commission. From there, you could expect the facility to be constructed in maybe 3 to 4 years. However, I think we need to be, reasonably optimistic that the bill will experience several variations if we can get it through the legislature. So to that point, Yunji, about what's next, I think opening day is January 20th. I think we've got a week to get the bill to the legislature. We've been very fortunate to have legislators who have already expressed support on both sides for introducing the bill. So if we can count on that support and get it in, then, like I mentioned earlier, this larger discussion with all of our lawmakers about how do we solve this puzzle? How do we solve this problem of $120 million shortfall every year? How do we address the fact that developing homes costs money that the state cannot afford to give the department right now, and the department can't generate on its own? I think that's the discussion that's really going to happen over the next month, 2 months, 3 months, depending on how long this legislative session lasts.
This concept of gambling is certainly not new to the conversation in Hawaii in general, not just speaking for a casino on Hawaiian lands, but just in the state in general. And so my question is, will the state sort of see any benefits from this? We know that this is something that the Department of Hawaiian Homelands wants to do to support your department and your agency, but will there be any sort of residual effect that will go into the entire state as well? And how is that going to be written into the law and this bill moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the bill is currently written that gross gaming revenue, which is basically all the revenue a casino makes on lost wagers, 45% of that will be taxed. 80% of that number will come to the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, and 20% will go to the state. A portion of that, like I mentioned, would be dedicated towards combating public health and safety concerns. Another portion would be set aside for the operation of the Gaming Commission, but the majority of that 20% would go directly to the state. That doesn't take into account, if it is an integrated resort, TAT benefits. That doesn't take into account all of the sales and economic benefit in the surrounding area. What the data shows is that small businesses and the economy itself is boosted in areas with the casino. So we can count on GET revenues increasing. We also know that in some areas, property values have risen. So there are a number of impacts outside of the department that could be realized by moving this forward.
Most of the comments, I have to say, we're seeing are pretty negative right now. What kind of calls are you getting, and how are you responding to the community's concerns about this idea?
I think it's really important to be open to the information. I think, for a really long time, this discussion has come to Hawaii and been combated with the fear of what could happen and what bad could happen in our state. And I think a lot of people have taken that to heart. And in that way, I think we share a sense of aloha and respect for place and a respect for our home. But I think what we're trying to bring to people is a reasonable discussion about two things. There is no other way for us to solve this problem at hand right now. And what the data shows is that a lot of the fears just aren't supported by the science. And that in large part is due to the fact that other regions don't want to see a casino here because they don't want us cutting into their profits. So they continue to mislead the public, and they continue to capitalize on those fears to get people to object to it. And I think what we have been hearing a lot of is that this just really isn't our brand. This is not the brand of Hawaii. This is not the brand of Aloha. And I don't think that's true either. I think Native Hawaiians have a long history of betting well before contact. And I think that Hawaiians for a long time have been the product in a commercial engine that has never really consulted them. I think a bill like this puts Native Hawaiians in a position to be self-sufficient and self-reliant. And in that, I've said this before, but self-sufficiency is self-determination. I think for a lot of our beneficiaries and a lot of the public who are expressing fears, when they hear that, I think it opens up the door to a new conversation about how do we empower ourselves to generate funding on our own that helps us complete and fulfill the mission of Prince Kuhio. And I think this does that. But like I said, it's going to be up to everyone to engage in those conversations and take the science how they will. But we've been trying really hard to make that available to everyone.
Let's talk a little bit about that and just having that open conversation, because we know that once this goes to the legislature, obviously there's a process in that where hearings will be held, discussions will be had, and people will have the opportunity to testify on the record at the state capitol. But is there any sort of conversation that's being had within the Hawaiian community about this topic specifically beyond just what's going to be taking place at the legislature? We saw what happened with the 30-meter telescope and just the overwhelming objection to that by the Native Hawaiian community, and many felt that they didn't have a voice. How are you going to address that issue of those people who are out there saying, we want an opportunity to speak, and maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be at the state capitol? Is there other sort of venue where you're going to allow for this conversation to take place?
Yep. So later this month, we'll have 2 opportunities to consult with our beneficiaries to get their feedback, but also to provide them with an in-depth presentation on where the risks really are, what the science says, and what the potential benefits are. I think for a lot of people who haven't yet read the bill, I think there is a very instinctive reaction to it. And so we will be having those discussions with our beneficiaries to have that opportunity to flesh it out and really get into the details of what this bill does, what it doesn't do, who it does benefit and who it doesn't. I think you're right in that those conversations are important, and we'll continue to have them.
There are some questions coming in about how this might impact proposals for a statewide lottery. This is totally separate, but would the gaming commission that you're talking about creating, would that have any authority over something like a lottery that would be, obviously not tied to any specific land?
As the bill is currently written, it does not grant authority to the commission to contemplate a lottery. That said, the bill could change. What I would remind folks is that what's different between the lottery and the integrated resort is the lottery places the responsibility of generating the revenue largely on residents. You count on residents to participate in the lottery to fund it, whereas an integrated resort shifts that burden largely to visitors, those with that, that magnitude of income where they can expend it at a casino. It shifts that burden to visitors. And I think that's something that's really important to consider, because I think we're all in agreement. We don't want Hawaii's people shouldering the vast majority of the cost burden. So that's something to think about. But like I said, the bill could be rewritten or changed in a way that would allow the Gaming Commission to contemplate a lottery.
Absent this idea, and let's say that it does not pass the legislature or the governor vetoes it or whatever happens down the line, what other ideas are you folks putting forward to address this issue? Because as you mentioned at the top of the show, that is a pretty startling number when you think about just the amount of time it will take to provide these homes for Native Hawaiians. What other options, I guess, are on the table at this point in time? Is this casino sort of the only thing that you currently have, sort of cooking in the kitchen right now? Is there any other option or any other viable idea that may come to fruition?
Before I get to that, I think it's really important to frame this in terms of the age of this problem. Many people may not know, but this July of 2021 will mark 100 years since the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act was enacted and signed. And in 100 years, you have to consider the number of staff, the number of directors and deputy directors who have come through this department with ideas to solve the problem, and think about where we're at. If you look at the last 40 alone, in the 70s, we amended the Constitution to secure better funding. In the 80s, we gave out completely undeveloped lots to low success rates. What we learned was many beneficiaries simply didn't have the time, the resources, or the capability to develop lots on their own without the department paying for the infrastructure. In the 90s, the federal and state governments passed legislation to make the department whole. And then throughout the 2000s, especially in the last decade, you see a diversified number of offerings. You see a diverse number of products. And what I'm getting at is there have been many, many attempts to try and figure out this problem over the last 100 years. And I think none of them, all those examples I gave, contemplated a dedicated, reliable revenue source at the scale that I'm talking about. So if you're asking, if this bill doesn't pass, what else is there? We've got 150 dedicated staff at this department who are going to continue to do the good work and fulfill the mission of Prince Kuhio every single day. our 5-year plan means we'll probably generate about 1,500 lots over the next 5 years. Is that the rate that everybody wants to see? No, but it's a reality of what we have with us and what we can do with that. In terms of new ideas, the Hawaiian Homes Commission recently approved a pilot project to provide down payment assistance on new homes. So there are always opportunities to innovate. But if you think about the scale of what we need, none of them come close to the opportunity to generate a minimum of $30 million in revenue. And that's not even considering the high end. I mean, there are gaming operations generating $1 billion in revenue, and I'm not promising that to anyone. But I think at that scale, there are no ideas in the last 100 years that come close to touching how incredible that could really be for Native Hawaiians and for this department.
I think one of the concerns might be that this will go beyond just that single entity in Kapolei, that we could see gaming, come to other parts of the island or other islands throughout the state. Tell us a little bit about how this law would be framed. Is it just allowing for a single entity, or would this, there's a lot of people who feel like Waikiki is already Vegas on the beach, if you will, just minus the casino. So how do we preserve so much of what we love about our state while allowing something like this to happen?
Well, the bill is written for only one license on Hawaiian homelands. But the honest truth is there's nothing, I mean, who knows who will be in the legislature in 50 years? I think what we have to continue to do is have open conversations with our lawmakers about what our priorities are and what they aren't. In the last 10 years, every session, there's been at least one, if not 4 or 5 different bills relating to gaming. And I expect the same to be true this session. And I think rather than saying why take this chance at the risk of it expanding is less productive, knowing that there are others who will be gunning for this opportunity every year hereafter, as they have been for the last 20. And so is there anything I can do to stop it from being more than one and someone amending the bill in 50 years? No, there's nothing that I can do about that right now. But I think if we lay the record and make it clear what limitations we want to put on it, I think that lends towards a stronger argument for stopping an expansion in the future if that were ever contemplated.
With the legislature set to open in a few weeks, and you mentioned that there are those lawmakers who have already reached out and who support this bill, who could be the ones that introduce this into the process. Have you had the opportunity to go around and maybe speak with members of the House and Senate to sort of pitch this idea, to get a better idea of how realistic this is? And if not, do you plan on doing that to further that conversation with lawmakers directly?
Yeah, we're beginning those discussions now. I think the sense that I'm getting is there is a lot of surprise about what the science actually shows on this. I think without getting into, what data there is and isn't, I think, like I mentioned earlier, people have a very sincere, instinctive reaction to this. But in these early discussions, we're getting the sense that people are open to contemplating, one, how do we solve this problem? Because there aren't really any strong ideas out there right now. And two, maybe the data suggests something that isn't as bad as we predicted. And I think we have to continue to have those discussions. And so we're grateful to those who are open to having them and accepting those appointments and meeting with us. Because, if we're not talking about it, then we're not really creating the opportunity for any solution to come forward. And I would say this has been, a really interesting opportunity to really get people realizing the scale at which this department is deficient in terms of what it needs to succeed.
I mean, to that point, Aaron Pong has a comment. He says, DHHL is stuck. This is a real idea. Otherwise, they will never meet the needs. If Hawaii is really against this, no chance for the organization to ever be successful. I mean, do you put it in those same terms, Brian? That was at 10:51. Do you think that is the choice here? It's sort of this or more of the same and people waiting, essentially, in some cases, people dying on the waiting list?
Without this bill, it will be more of the same until we can find new ideas. And I'm not saying that the casino bill is the end all to our problems, and I'm not saying it is the magic bullet for both us and the state. But what I am saying is, given our current situation, it is the only option we've got out there right now, contemplating how bad the problem really is. And to me, if we can get people on a regular basis talking about this problem at scale, I mean, that's a small win, even if the bill doesn't pass. But I do think that, moving forward, without this bill, it really will be status quo until something else comes along.
Well, as our time sort of wraps up here, we want to allow you just the opportunity to have one final thought, maybe as you move forward with this process. Obviously, when we look at these comments, there's a lot of people who are against this idea, but there may be others in the community who support it. Maybe if you can sort of talk about finding that balance moving forward, and any other final thoughts that you may have here in these final moments.
We've been really fortunate to hear from a huge cross section of the community, both in support and in opposition, and that's everyone's individual right. What we do encourage people to do is to really think about, those two things: how big this problem really is, how difficult it is to solve, and what the science shows. And if we can get people thinking along those lines, I think that's a win for this department, whether or not the bill gets passed. I think maybe out there, someone might be watching this, or someone might be thinking about it, and they may have another big idea, and we'd be happy to hear that. But that's the first steps, and we're really happy to have these conversations with the public, with the legislature, about how do we position this department for success for the next 100 years, and really getting our Native Hawaiian community to a point where we are self-sufficient, we are self-reliant, and that's a self-determinative act that so many Indigenous communities have fought for. And when they've gained it, they've really benefited. And I think that, this is a huge opportunity for Native Hawaiians as well.
Okay, well, Tyler Gomes, Deputy Chair of the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, thank you so much for joining us this morning and for taking all of our questions. It was great to take a deep dive on this issue.
Thank you guys so much.
Aloha. Thanks.
Thank you. For those of you who are writing in, we see a lot of comments asking about the science that Tyler's referring to there. So we invite you to, when this broadcast is finished, go back to the beginning, but because he laid out some data from Harvard University and some other studies that they are looking at that shows the percentage of people who continue with illegal gambling and other sort of effects, if you will, of bringing in a casino, and sort of debunking some of what some of you are saying in the comments. This is, of course, a very sensitive issue, and that's why we invited him on. We gave him the full half hour, and we appreciate all of you who are writing in this morning.
Yeah, certainly not a lack of passion in the comment section here today, and rightfully so. This is an issue, of course, that really just spurs up a lot of emotion, and it is not something that, again, that is limited to just this topic, and including this proposal that the Department of Hawaiian Homelands is putting forth, but an issue about gambling in the state of Hawaii in general that has been discussed many times over the past few years. And as COVID-19 has impacted the budget, many are looking for alternatives, and this is one that is being presented. He also talked about just the realistic outlook of moving forward through the legislature. Of course, it will be a bill that has to get support in both chambers of the House and Senate. We know that there has been at times a lot of negative comments that have already come forth by those in the legislature that have opposed any form of gambling in the past. And so this may be a difficult bill to push through, but as he mentioned, it's more about just beginning the conversation about some of the broader issues that the department and agency is facing in terms of providing homes for Native Hawaiians.
Right. And I mean, he did lay out a pretty dire circumstance when you look at people waiting 30, 40 years to get off that list. And they have a tremendous budget shortfall. And so there's just no way for them to meet the need, even with state support. The state, as you noted, is facing an enormous budget shortfall. I believe is $1.4 billion is the latest projection. That's minus, of course, the second CARES Act, which we're still sorting through to figure out what the level of support is from the federal government. But that said, there's no way that the state can fund it to the degree that it needs to move these parcels into the hands of people who rightly deserve them. So how do they get out of this? This is a pretty radical idea, but it is one that sounds like it has some traction in the ledge. And he did say that they will be hosting some community meetings. So we will keep you informed about that, because I'm sure, judging by the comments we got today, there will be a lot of people who want to attend those.
Yeah, and someone who can speak directly to that and his thoughts will be Speaker Scott Saiki, who will be joining this conversation on Wednesday. We're going to be speaking to the Speaker of the House to get his thoughts, not only, of course, on this proposal that is being put forth by DHHL, but also on the impacts of COVID-19 in our community, the impact that it will have, of course, on this state's economy, and what other sources of revenue the state will be looking at, noting that tourism will continue to struggle in 2021. We know that furloughs for the moment have been put on hold until the middle of this year, thanks to the CARES Act funding. But many say that that is a Band-Aid that's being put on a wound. And what is sort of the longer term plan for the state in terms of economic support and getting those revenues back up? We'll be speaking to the House Speaker about that on Wednesday at 10:30.
That's right. And then on Friday, the governor will join us. We'll get his thoughts on all of that. Hopefully by then we'll have more time to have sorted through the CARES Act and we can get his take. When he was on here last time, they were just sort of getting that information. And he did say that he anticipated delays. As you said, now we're thinking that furloughs have been delayed till the summer. But what happens beyond that? So lots to talk about. We appreciate all of you being here. Please share this video and make sure that this information gets out to people who would find it interesting. And join us, of course, on Wednesday with Speaker Saiki right here at 10:30.
Aloha. We'll see you then.